I just finished this sweater and it only cost me a bit under 30 euros, but somehow it looks like one of my most polished pieces. Which made me realize that price is not what makes something look expensive at all. And that kind of got me thinking, what does make a handmade piece look more elevated? Hi there and welcome to another video. My name is Luisa, but everybody calls me Lu, and today I am wearing my latest finished object, the Afra sweater by Lyon, which cost me a whopping 29 euros and 47 cents, including the pattern. And it made me realize that some of my sweaters feel like this, really easy to wear and quite polished, and others just don't, even if I like them just as much or even used more expensive yarn. So I started paying more attention to what actually makes that difference. Not as rules or anything like that, just small things I've been noticing in my knitting that seem to change how a piece looks overall. And I thought I'd share them with you. And I think the first place I noticed was actually in the fabric itself, because fabric's kind of the foundation of everything when we are talking about hand knit items. The density of the fabric, for example, if it's too loose, the garment looks flimsy or stretched out. It has really no structure, just like that old t-shirt we've had for more than a decade that doesn't even stay perfectly flat anymore, but it's so soft, it's the only thing we want to wear all day. But on the other hand, if it's too tight of a fabric, it looks stiff and it doesn't really have a good fit. It looks weird here under the arm, or at least that's what happens with my sweaters. So for a while now, I've been trying to find that sweet spot where I get defined stitches, but the fabric still moves. I have a structured but soft garment, and in my opinion, it gives a much more elevated look. When I learned to knit, I used to think that tighter, denser fabrics was the way to go, but slowly I've been learning otherwise. Another thing I really like to pay attention to is the yarn texture and the halo. A bit of fuzz, like mohair and alpaca blends, when there's no allergy in the mix, in my opinion, adds a little bit of depth and softness to the fabric. Now, I know I'm partial to this topic because I love a good fluff, but I think flat yarns can look maybe one-dimensional, more like everyday wear. And to get that really special looking sweater, you have to lean more on styling, and I don't really know how to do that, so I prefer to add fuzz to my projects to get a little extra step without much effort on my part. Another thing I find really important is the drape. Some fabrics fall nicely, like this one I'm wearing today and this other example I've brought to show you guys today. This is a really flowy, really soft fabric. You can see the garment has movement. It's really comfortable to wear, but others kind of hold their shape more, which is the case of this other sweater. I don't know if it's coming across on camera, but in person you can clearly see this fabric's much stiffer and it doesn't really have as much movement. A good drape adds fluid movement to the piece, kind of like the piece has life, it breathes, and it gives a much more flattering and also more elevated look to the finished garment. Sometimes a stiffer fabric is actually the goal, in that case all good, but that's not often the case with me. I'm usually trying to get a really flowy fabric with my projects, so well, that's what I've been noticing with my knitting. And I'm not talking about expensive yarn at all. I have sweaters in more affordable yarns that look better just because the fabric worked out nicer, which is the case of the sweater I'm wearing today. But then I started noticing that even when the fabric was nice, something could still feel a bit off when I wore it. And that's when the fit comes into play. The fit is the thing I notice the most when I wear my sweaters, and also the thing that stresses me out the most when I'm knitting. Because with fit, things either click or don't, I would say, and I'm very particular with the fit I want for my sweaters. The shoulder placement, for example, I would say is the most important area by far for a good fit. If the shoulder sits in the right place here, everything falls into place, but if the shoulder is off, the whole sweater looks out of shape, kind of like it has no structure. I usually knit drop shoulder constructions, drop shoulder sweaters, sometimes raglans, and sometimes a satin sleeve, which is the case of the sweater I'm wearing today. And everything is fine, but I think each construction outlines the body in different ways. For example, this satin sleeve really highlights the shoulder area here. It really defines where your shoulder ends and the underarm and things like that. So I think it gives a really flattering and more structured look to the final piece. When we are talking about raglans, it's kind of the same idea, but I don't think it highlights as well as a satin sleeve does. I have this raglan construction, raglan sweater here. I've been trying to knit more raglans this year, but this I finished in December of 2025. But anyway, I don't think it's as structured as a satin sleeve. And when we look at a drop shoulder construction, I think this is actually a bad example to show you because the pickup line here for the sleeve is hidden in this lace pattern, but I think a drop shoulder construction gives a more informal look to the piece, which doesn't mean is not as elevated or not as expensive looking as other constructions. It doesn't mean that one is better or the other is wrong. It's just a different idea. Another thing that I think really impacts the elevated look of a sweater is the neckline. If it's too tight, it feels uncomfortable and it doesn't really look good because it doesn't feel good. But on the other hand, if it's too wide, it looks like it's slipping and it kind of looks messy. Not in a bad way, but maybe it's a more relaxed look. I have a few sweaters with a really wide bolt neck and I really like wearing them. I feel really good when I wear them, but it's just a different idea for the finished piece. And the same thing happens with sleeves. A bit of volume, like the sleeves I have here today, feels very modern and intentional, and it's also really comfortable to wear. I am liking puffy sleeves more and more lately, which is really interesting because when I started knitting, I only liked really fitted sleeves, but nowadays I've been leaning more towards this puffy, roomy, oversized fit, and well, I'm just going with the flow. A fitted look just gives a different vibe to the finished object and it really depends on the goal, on what we are picturing for a project. But what I think it's really important is to have a clear silhouette. It gives a harmonic look, like intentional design elements that come together in synchrony. For me, a expensive looking sweater, let's say, looks like you meant it, like you took the time to think about the fit, the silhouette, the sleeve length and things like that. It feels decided, like you knew what you wanted and you made it happen. And that translates into the polished look a final piece has. And then there are all the small details that don't really stand out until they're off and become the only thing your eyes want to focus on, and that's when the finishing details come into play. For me, ribbing is maybe the most important finishing detail. It frames the whole piece. If the ribbing looks even, I have a sweater here. If the knit columns look straight, if the ribbing has even tension throughout, it gives a much more elevated look to the entire piece. It frames the whole piece. I would say ribbing has the power to break the clean look if it's not really that neat, or at least not the way I like my ribbings to look. For example, if I'm folding over a collar and it looks kind of slanted to one side, in my opinion, it breaks the entire clean look of a garment. I think that's really important because That's really what we see more clearly when wearing a garment, especially the cuffs, because we are always moving our hands, which is the case of the sweater I just showed you. I took the extra time and effort to knit a really neat ribbing, or at least a 1x1 ribbing that I was satisfied with, because I knew I was going to look at this ribbing a lot, especially the cuff. And with this really light yarn, I knew it was going to show every single inconsistency in tension and things like that. So I took the extra time to get a really clean looking 1x1 ribbing, which is also the case for clean transitions. I think they have the power to make or break the polished look. For example, when switching from stockinette to ribbing, the pickup rate for the neckline, I always play around with needle sizes to get a seamless look and also to avoid any rowing out issues, which brings me to consistency in stitches. For me, it's really important to have even tension throughout, so that's why I'm always switching needle sizes to avoid rowing out, like I said. And I also think invisible joints are really important. The goal is that you don't notice when one bow ends and the new one begins. Those are little details you don't notice. It looks good until it looks off, and it's certainly the only thing your eyes want to focus on. But once those things are in place, I feel like what really changes the overall look is how everything works together. And that means color. I'm not talking about those rules like color pairing or color theory or anything like that. It's more about harmony. People have different opinions when it comes to color. There are likes, dislikes, color pairing preferences, and all of that. And that's completely fine. I've heard many people saying, oh, muted colors or neutral tones look more elevated. I don't particularly agree with that idea. In my opinion, the key is to have cohesive tones. For example, a high and soft contrast. Contrasting combinations can feel less cohesive in certain situations. For example, if I'm working on a busy design with color work, a lot of texture and things like that, I usually go for a soft contrast, like is the case of a sweater I have on my needles. I am adding a V-neck to this project. There's 3 different bands of color work throughout the body of this sweater. It is a drop shoulder, so I decided to go with a softer contrast, like what I have here. I chose a dark red and kind of a medium blushy pink instead of a really drastic contrast, let's say. But if I'm working on a simple design with clean lines and stripes especially, I prefer to go with bolder contrasts. It's not really the case of this sweater I already showed you, but I chose to add the pink to this color combo to make it stand out next to skin, because if I just kept this light gray yarn here situation next to skin, it would really wash me out. And there's another sweater here that I chose a really bright red and a wine color to pair with it. I wouldn't really choose this color combination if I was working on a color work project or anything busier in terms of design elements. But with stripes, I feel really confident in choosing bolder color contrasts. I see my skin as one of the colors I'm trying to pair with whatever color I'm thinking about needing a sweater in, or any other garment for that matter, and the same thing goes for hair color. Sometimes the same sweater may look way more polished and elevated on you than it does on me, just because we have different skin tones and hair colors. Which is fine, but I always try to be mindful of that. This is the case of this Slipover I'm working on now. I had this really light pink tone in my stash, and I knew it was going to wash me out, so I decided to work on a vest. That way I can color coordinate with whatever I am wearing underneath this vest to make it not really blending with my skin tone as much. The role color plays in a garment looking expensive or not depends on the environment, I would say. It kind of needs context. It's not just a matter of black looks more elegant than white or beige is better than bright red. I don't agree with that idea. For me, the key is simplicity. Too many elements competing for attention like color work, texture, shaping, lace. It can feel a bit busy, and I would say it's better to let one thing shine than to have all elements talking at once and we don't know where to focus on first. And then there's everything that happens after you finish knitting, and that's when I want to talk about blocking. This is like the glow up moment every finished object deserves. I like to block all my finished knits, even when it doesn't feel like blocking will make any difference. Sometimes it's a drastic transformation, like this Slipover I already showed you guys. You can see the back panel has been blocked and it looks good. And the front panel is a mess. So it really needs a good blocking, but sometimes you don't really notice any difference. Even then, I would say the stitches even out, it relaxes the fabric, it makes everything settle into place, and sometimes even when it looks the same, the drape is better. The fabric is softer, and that translates into a better fit and, in my opinion, a more polished look for the final piece. Taking care of hand knits is also really important, I would say, to get a more polished look. For example, depiling when needed. I love depiling my sweaters. I find it really relaxing and a really enjoyable process, but I know many people don't agree with me, and giving a good bath to help reshape a garment is also a good idea. How we store things really affects how they look when we wear them again. For example, if we leave a sweater on hangers, a hanger can leave a dent in the fabric. If a sweater is folded for a really long time, you'll get those lines here across the body. So I think giving old knits a day at the spa can refresh an old knit and make it look brand new, which translates again into a more polished look in the end. Expensive looking isn't just how we knit it, it's how we keep it, I would say. And something can be beautifully made, but if it's not cared for, it won't look that way for long. So now the most obvious thing that impacts how a polished garment looks is the way we style it, which is also the trickiest thing for me. The same sweater can have a completely different vibe depending on what we pair with it. For example, a casual outfit versus a structured look. Everything hangs on proportion. I think I don't really understand much about styling my clothes, but I think proportion is really important. If we wear a sweater tucked, like the way French tuck, or untucked, if we pair it with pants, dresses, or skirts, it all impacts the way the same sweater looks, and it can look 300 euros or 30 euros depending on the way we style it. That said, I have no idea how to style my clothes. I need to get better at it as soon as possible, but I don't really have the energy to learn. I may throw it on, do a 3 second check in the mirror, and 10 seconds later I'm out the door kind of person. So I can't really complain that I don't know how to style my clothes, but what I do know is it's important. I guess what I'm trying to say is sometimes, if not most times, it's a matter of how we wear something and not about how perfectly well executed a sweater was, or we used the fancy yarn. But if we wear a flat, everyday sweater and pair it with nice accessories, create an outfit that highlights that basic sweater, it will look just as fancy and chic. I just don't know how to do that. But many people do, and thank you, because I often get ideas from those people. But anyway, moving on to intentional tweaks. Sometimes, if not always, in my opinion, we need to put our own spin on our projects. Adjust things to our preferences, to our body, or to the idea we have in mind. For example, sleeve length, ribbing, neckline, shortening, armhole depth, which is the bane of my knitting life. If you watch my podcast episodes, you know I always have issues with the armhole depth, but that's a talk for another day. Sometimes just small changes are enough to make it feel more like it's made for you. It's customized and it's not straight off pattern without thought. I'm not saying we have to modify something just for the sake of saying it's customized, but most knitwear designers create patterns based on their own bodies so that they can try it on as they go, check the fit, see if their idea is working, and that's completely fine. But it doesn't mean that what works for them will work for us. So sometimes a project needs a little extra hand to give us the fit we expect or the look we have in mind. I know I'm biased when it comes to adapting patterns because I do it regularly and I love experimenting with my knitting, being adventurous and trying new things, but that's me. Sometimes I follow the pattern to a T and I don't change a single stitch and everything works just as well. So there's that. And to wrap this up, I want to share what I used to focus on that doesn't actually matter as much as I thought. For example, super expensive yarn doesn't actually mean better. Of course, nicer yarns can feel amazing and behave beautifully, but I've definitely had situations where a more affordable yarn gave me a fabric I liked more than a more expensive one. If gauge isn't right, if drape is weird, if the fabric is loose, the price tag won't fix any of that. The fabric we create matters way more than what the yarn costs. And I also used to believe that the more complex a pattern was, the more impressive the final piece would look. With time, I found that simpler pieces often look more elevated. If there's too much happening at once, your eye don't know where to land. Everything feels busy, so simple garments can mean that the fabric has room to shine, finishing touches are more noticeable, every detail, as small as it may be, has their moment in the spotlight and nothing is fighting for attention. Sweaters, or any handmade piece for that matter, don't need to be technically perfect to look good. Imperfections are often invisible, and that's one of the things I am definitely learning along my knitting journey. Little things I notice while knitting disappear once I wear the piece. I am very critical of my own knitting and I want everything to be just perfect, but I am learning that we notice our own mistakes more than anyone else ever will, so it's not because my increases don't look textbook perfect that my sweater won't look elevated, but that's just my opinion. I think what I've realized through all of this is that it's more about those small intentional choices that make everything a bit more considerate. And I'm definitely still figuring this out, but it's been really interesting to see how much of a difference these little things can make. I'd actually be really curious if you've noticed something similar in your own knitting, or if there's one thing that makes a piece feel more put together to you. But those are just some things I've been thinking about lately. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. If you enjoyed this video and feel like sticking around, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. I'd love to have you here and it really helps the channel. I'll see you next week with a fresh new podcast episode, and until then, happy knitting. Bye!